Good evening, everyone. I'm Emily Burns. I'm the program director with Sky Island Alliance, and I'm also a conservation scientist studying wildlife along the border. I will be your moderator for this evening, and now the panelists are going to introduce themselves.
I'm Daniel. I'm the director of the film.
Hi, everyone. I'm Steph. I'm a writer at the New Yorker magazine and the reporter and producer of American Scar.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining all of us. I'm John Kurc. I did some of the filming and the video.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Jose Manuel Perez. I am the director of operation of Cuenca de los Ojos, a nonprofit organization down in Agua Prieta, Sonora, Mexico.
My name is Myles Traphagen. I'm the Borderlands program coordinator for Wildlands Network, and I'm based in Tucson, Arizona, and have been working along this beautiful Borderlands area for about 25 years now.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with all of you this evening. And we want to start with talking with you, Daniel, just to understand, I mean, the US border on the southern end of the country is 2,000 miles long. So how did you choose this corner of the Southwest to center your story? What was it about this place that spoke to you?
So Steph actually introduced me to the story and to John, and getting on the phone with everyone for the first time, and especially John, just totally blew me away, seeing his commitment to uncovering the story, the fact that he's given up all of his commercial work, put his stuff in storage, and is now living out of his car at the border. At the time, it was 7 months into his journey. Now I believe he's almost at 2 years into the journey, living off of his life savings. And I had never, in all my years of reporting, had ever come across someone as committed to uncovering a truth as I did with John. And then I think the second part was looking at his drone footage, some of which you see in the film and much of which goes beyond it. And it just completely blew me away. The wall sitting in New York City was an abstraction for me, I think the way it is for many Americans. And seeing John's footage just made me see the border wall project in a completely different way. So it became my mission, through John's work, to help people kind of see just how inefficient and destructive the border wall project ultimately is.
Well, you're in New York and you came down here to Arizona and you came to the border, and I'm just sort of guessing that you've had experiences going up to the Canadian border prior to coming down here. So can you just share a little bit about the contrast that you found from the northern border of this country down to the southern?
I know it quite well. I went to school in Montreal at McGill, and my sister just moved to Toronto and had her first kid there. So I've made many trips to Canada, and the Canadian border looks nothing like the southern border. The southern border, as I'm sure everyone knows on this call, and I learned, is heavily militarized. You have 2,000 foot peaks that are a natural barrier, and then a 30-foot fence that doesn't work to begin with, carved into the mountain right in front of it. And you never see a site like that on the northern border, and it makes you ask why.
Well, John, I mean, you show us so much in the film with your drone photography and just sharing your impressions of being down there. I'm really struck by the fact that you said you didn't run into people at the border. You went from a rock concert down to the border expecting to see huge crowds. And really, who did you see? Who have you seen over these last few years along the border?
Yeah, and initially we were being told on American media, a lot of the channels, that the country was being invaded. So I was in Phoenix in 2019 and wanted to see the invasion, which I knew wasn't happening. But that was my original trip. I rented a car, went down there in August of 2019, saw absolutely nothing. In the majority of these areas, especially in Arizona, there was no fence and no invasion. Came back in a month later, was just fascinated with that narrative to show people that we were not being invaded. And after COVID hit, my fourth trip down, everything completely changed. I traveled all the way from Texas to San Diego on the border, any of it that was accessible. And when I got to Arizona, I was just horrified with what I saw, the destruction of these pristine places that I had seen prior. And the story changed very quickly. At that point, I was in a position to sit, many hours, gathering this footage of the canyons, especially in Guadalupe Canyon, where CLO and Jose Manuel are very familiar with. And that it kind of has become, my life project, is continuing to document this. Not as much devastation now, but there's a lot of militarization of the border, and obviously the human rights are a huge issue with me. So the story has grown quite a bit.
Absolutely. There's an audience question that's come in. What sort of opposition did you face and the American SCAR team generally trying to produce this film, record this film on the border?
I can speak for myself. I've never felt any hostility or threat from a migrant. I encounter them quite a bit. Where I do find the hostility is from the construction workers, whether it's Kiowit or Fisher Sand and Gravel, or they did not like me being there. I've also been confronted quite a bit by Customs Border Patrol and Department of Homeland Security.
Yeah. You also show some really interesting drone footage of bison, and that was another question that came in. Where did you see the bison along the border?
I'll let Myles take credit for it. I got the footage. However, he and I were out. He's my pal when we go out and stir up some trouble. We were on our way to Animas Valley in New Mexico, and I thought they were cows, over to our right. And Myles goes, "Oh my God, that's the Hidalgo Hannes bison herd." And I was like, I just thought they were cows. So if Myles had not been there, I would have just kept going. Myles can talk to the historical significance of that herd.
I think that really speaks to the misconceptions of the borderlands, and that most of America thinks it's a wasteland. It's deserts. There's just nothing but evil going on here. The orcs are invading. When the reality, it's a very diverse place. In fact, the screenshot that you see behind Emily Burns, that's in the San Rafael Valley, which is south of Tucson, and the elevation there is over 5,000 feet. And in fact, that exact same spot is where they filmed the musical Oklahoma, the Rodgers and Hammerstein musical. And that there's black bear and jaguar and bison. And that bison herd has been in the boot heel of New Mexico, roaming between Chihuahua and New Mexico for over 100 years. And it's part of the local lore and the local legend. And I think that when we saw that, it was just quite serendipitous, because I hadn't seen those animals in 15 years. And here we were heading towards Antelope Wells, where they had constructed 6 miles of border wall, basically blocking off the entire Playas Valley. And nobody had seen the herd for a while, so they figured maybe they were in Chihuahua. But I kind of feel that they may be stuck in the US now.
Mm. Well, Jose Manuel, I would love to hear more about your experience. You've been living and working on the border, managing lands on both sides of the border for decades. And I'm really curious, what have you observed as changes in recent years? What has changed on your lands that you're managing since this border wall construction has accelerated through Southeast Arizona?
Yeah, Emily, thank you. Yeah, I have the fortune to work on Cuenca, Los Ojos. It's a Mexican non-government organization that managed a really hot spot of biodiversity on the Sonoran side. Right now we have managed over 120,000 acres of protected land, and it's a really unique area of biodiversity. As an example, we have the highest biodiversity of bees in the San Bernardino Valley, just east of the town of Douglas in Agua Prieta. We, on the past, we didn't see too much of issues with the people trying to cross through our properties on the Mexican side. The antennas that the US government used to protect or to prevent people to crossing were working perfectly. And we probably see a group every 2 or 3 months, and most of the area was not using for migrants. Once they start building the wall, they start having a lot of roads, new roads, fields for the construction of the wall. And with that, the traffic really increased. Now we see one group every other day. And there's our days that we have seen 2 or 3 groups the same day that are crossing. And as John mentioned at the end of the film, the wall is not stopping the migrants to cross into the United States.
Yeah, it's very powerful at the end to see that, the money that has been invested in this structure that is not going to be permanent. I'm curious, Jose Manuel, for you in Sonora, when you meet with your neighbors, other ranchers around the area, what are people in Mexico feeling about the wall? Did they feel part of this, or has this happened to them, on the edge of their property? I'm curious what your perception is.
Yeah, most of the people that grow on the borders has the richness of 2 cultures bringing all together and make a creosote of cultures between the Mexican and the US cultures. And people used to live and grow together, go to school in both sides of the border, then go in the afternoon to have a soccer, play soccer with the Mexican folks, and then go back to have the swimming pool on the US side. And with the wall, all that culture is being stopped. And there is a lot of ratios created on the area, and a lot of tension between our neighbors and our cultures. And it's really a shame having that and seeing that. And we're seeing right now a lot of more people going through our properties and having a lot of garbage and a lot of trash in all the way that they are going through. These are really a shame having that issue on the land.
Thank you for sharing that. Well, I want to pivot to you, Myles. I'm hoping you can shed a little bit more light on the enabling conditions that led to sort of a runaway border construction under the Trump administration. I think for many people, the perception is the border wall was a Trump issue, and it started with Trump and it's ending with Trump, but actually the groundwork was laid much earlier. Can you describe what happened with the Real ID Act in more detail?
Yeah, I've observed the evolution of the border, the militarization and all the infrastructure that's been built there starting in 1996. And so just, ironically, my career began on the property adjacent to where Jose Manuel has been managing the San Bernardino National Wildlife Refuge. And so his organization, Cuenca Los Ojos, has the Rancho San Bernardino. In 2007, they began to build a vehicle barrier across the refuge. And when they arrived, they just started bulldozing through the stream there that was established for the protection of endangered native fishes, native to the Rio Yaqui watershed. And in any other federal project, there would be the NEPA process. That's the National Environmental Policy Act. There would be environmental impact statements, the biological assessments, opinions. But in 2005, Congress, in its lowest point as an organization that should have long-term wisdom, passed the Real ID Act of 2005. And of course, this is a 9/11 response type of thing. And in Section 102 of that act, there's a provision that allows the Secretary of Homeland Security, who is an unelected, politically appointed official, the ability to waive virtually all laws for the construction of border barriers. So this includes the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Native American Graves and Protection Act, the Bald Eagle and Golden Eagle Protection Act, and the list goes on. If there's one of your favorite acts, cultural and protection, environmental protection acts that you like, it has been violated. And I think beyond just the border wall itself and what has happened on the land and what we have observed in this horrible scar in the destruction and blowing up wilderness areas and national parks and protected areas, I think the American public needs to be very frightened, because this is a slippery slope to fascism. When one person has the ability to bypass all of Congress, that they're beyond impunity. So the Real ID Act of 2005 really enabled the border wall to be constructed at the pace that it did and without any oversight. And so we're already seeing that there are downstream impacts that are occurring, such as portions of the wall being ripped apart, storms and flood events tearing the gates off of that, major erosional events. So they're basically making it up as they went along when they did the construction. And this is really no way that America should be managing its natural resources and its protected areas, when this country has been a global pioneer in conservation of natural resources and environmental and cultural protection. So the repeal of the Real ID Act of 2005 needs to happen, because eventually it'll touch every American, living or dead.
Yes, understandable. So, Stephania, you had an article come out from the New Yorker on Saturday with American Scar at the same time. And the title is "The Border Wall is Outliving Trump." Now, there are a lot of reasons for that, and it isn't just because the wall is still standing. I'm wondering if you could share a little bit what led you to that pretty serious conclusion that the wall's not over.
Definitely. Thank you for that question, Emily. And thank you everyone for joining. I'll just mention quickly that I'm in Spain and it's almost 3 a.m. here, so please be a little patient with me. I mean, that is a question that is really at the center of both the film and the article, right? My reporting on this started right after the political transition in 2020. And, you know, I think in the aftermath of the inauguration, a lot of people thought that because Trump was gone, we could just forget about the wall. And I think that everyone here knows that that's certainly not the case, right? And there were so many questions that were left unanswered, right? For one thing, we didn't really know what was going to happen with all of the eminent domain cases in Texas, all of the families who had sued the government because they did not want to sell their lands, and whose cases were not settled yet, right? As you know, the Trump administration awarded contracts up until the last days, right? And so there was a big question about what was going to happen with those contractors, right? Who had signed contracts with the government. And of course, the new administration was facing millions in payouts to those contractors. And then, of course, there was a question of the environmental damage, right? And here, I think, you know, there's absolutely no question that we would not have been able to do this work without you guys, because it is through your footage, through the footage that you've been able to capture with your trail cameras, John, you know, by being there in places where no one else is, you know, and documented what no one else was seeing except the contractors, right? And so at the end of the day, you were able to really show how the construction was affecting the migratory patterns of species. And I'm sure that, you know, in the years to come, we'll reach many more conclusions around this, right? But you were the first witnesses to this. And so I think that in my mind, those three questions needed to be answered, and in many ways have yet to be answered too. And so that is really what drove the film, and the piece. And then of course, you know, and I mentioned this in the article, the wall is being built as we speak, right? It did not end with Trump, and now with Abbott investing hundreds of millions of dollars on his border wall project, I mean, I think that we can expect to see many more miles of wall being built in the years to come.
Absolutely. Unfortunately, that does feel to be the case. We've been having some theme coming in of questions from the audience around, well, what is the Biden administration actually doing? What is their position? On day one, there was a proclamation that said there wouldn't be any more feet of border wall, but what you're just saying and what we're witnessing is that's not the case. So what is the Biden administration doing?
So I think that if you were to ask them, and this is certainly the response that we got from them, they'll tell you that they're dealing with a great mess, right? That they inherited from the previous administration, and that they're doing as best as they can to remediate the damage, right? Of course, I'm not a spokesperson to the administration, but one of the main questions around this is what is going to happen with the millions of dollars that Congress appropriated for the construction of a barrier along the southern border, right? We saw, of course, that the president did a lot to reappropriate much of the money that the Trump administration had set aside for the purposes of the construction. But again, the big question here now, I think, has to do with the money that Congress has not rescinded or repurposed, right? And we've seen that CBP has taken some important steps towards the construction of the 86 miles of wall along the border in the Rio Grande Valley section, right? I think one of the what has been most troubling, I think, to a lot of people is the fact that the president never appointed kind of a senior liaison to deal with the people on the ground, border communities, right? And to convey a clear message as to what was going to be the administration's strategy vis-a-vis the border wall. And so I think that was absolutely crucial. And then in addition to the 86 miles of wall in the Rio Grande Valley, there's a question about what's going to happen with the gaps that remain, right? And I know that this is a very, very contentious topic. We can get into this further. But when we had Secretary Mayorkas in the spring of last year come out and say, we're going to fill those gaps, I mean, the reaction was just real shock, right? And so now there's a question of where will those gaps be? How big will they be? And again, we just don't have all the answers that we would hope for.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, both Myles and I have spent time poring over the remediation plans that have been proposed for different sectors of the border. Myles, what's your fast take on these remediation plans? Is this actually stabilizing infrastructure, or is it starting the restoration and healing process?
It is the former. The remediation plans that have been put forth by Customs and Border Patrol, there's been 3 so far. 2 have been signed off on, 1's open for comments now. It was addressing things like erosion to the patrol road. It was addressing gaps in the border wall. It was focusing on cattle guards and culverts so that the border wall would not be eroded away in flood events. So they were basically cleaning up what they failed to account for during the rushed construction. Keep in mind that many of these contracts were awarded in a very non-standard fashion. They were essentially given away. The prime example being Tommy Fisher going on a certain news network and basically lobbying for the border wall and then getting billions of dollars of contracts. But there's been no part of the remediation plans that are actually addressing effects on wildlife, effects on streams, and making sure that wild and scenic rivers can flow freely. We have several of those in Arizona, the San Pedro River being one of them, the Santa Cruz River, and various other streams in very critically important wildlife areas. The migration of the Sonoran pronghorn, also known as the antelope, that has not been addressed, and its migratory routes that have probably occurred for tens of thousands of years have been blocked off at the Cabeza Prieta National Wildlife Refuge. The jaguar, which has been recolonizing Arizona and New Mexico for the last 25 years, quite regularly. Those critical habitat units have been walled off in certain locations. So the actual harms to the environment are not being addressed. And if you go to any urban area, such as Nogales, Tijuana, Ciudad Juarez, El Paso, there's razor wire, concertina wire that's on the US side. And that's a very dangerous, deadly type of material. And beyond its immediate effects on whatever animal or person may encounter that, what are going to be the long-term effects on border communities, on children who grow up in an area where border militarization has become normalized? And they know no different, that somehow it's normal to have razor wire and helicopters and 24,000 Border Patrol agents running around at all hours of the night and Fourth Amendment protections waived. I'm really concerned about what's going to be the future effects of this.
Absolutely. Well, I guess I hear you talk about that, and I'm thinking about, but what about the downstream in many places of impacts into Sonoran communities? This is not their wall. And I'm curious, what has the response of the Mexican government been to this and to communities that are affected on the Mexican side? Either Stephania or Jose Manuel.
Yeah, unfortunately none. Our government haven't say anything about the wall, anything about the effects that we are having by the blasting of the construction of the wall, and all the areas that were affected on the Mexican side. And another example is even that the 2021 was a normal year of rain, the gates on Silver Creek, or Arroyo Grande, as we know in Sonora, the gates were open before the monsoon season, and they were tied with a chain, and that chain didn't resist the energy of the water on a normal flood of 2 inches of rain on the Chiricahua Mountains. And that wall, those gates with those chains were forced and block the normal water or flow of the water on the creek, and start collecting and having more water on the US side until the force was too big. They broke the gates and they rip up the gates into the Mexican side, and the amount of water at that when they were start opening create a huge effect and a huge erosion. And we demonstrate that to the SILA, to the Water and Boundary Commission, and pointing them that the importance of prevent a big event and calculate the amount of water that is going to be coming through those washes, San Bernardino Wash, or the Silver Creek, or Guadalupe Wash, or San Pedro River, or Santa Cruz River. They didn't calculate the amount of water on a big event, and we are really worried if that happens again, that could damage, wash out a lot and create a lot of erosion on the Mexican side. It could also damage Highway 2 or other infrastructure in our properties on the Mexican side. And the Mexican government unfortunately haven't said anything about it or tried to prevent or create a program for the washes and those floods, but also addressing the wildlife corridors that are needed on these areas. It's really important, as Myles mentioned, big animals, but also small insects like small bees that depends on the flow of the air to pollinate plants in both sides of the border. And with this wall, the water or the airflow is going to be drastically affected. And with that, the pollinations of many plants on both sides of the border. So both governments need to sit down and talk about how are going to be addressing the remediation of this construction and how to open safety gaps for wildlife and for pollinators to migrate in both sides of the border.
As a reporter, I'll just add that when I started working on this project, it was quite shocking to see that all of the coverage, or nearly all of the coverage, was on the US side, right? There was little press about what was happening on the Mexican side. And then once we got to the ground and met Jose Manuel and other environmentalists on the Mexican side, it was just incredibly shocking to see that silence was very manifest, right, in many, many ways. And I think that we don't know if it's hard to assign motive, obviously, but we don't know if this was a political calculus from the Mexican government. At the end of the day, the government did not end up paying for the wall. And so maybe, it was a transaction and at the end of the day, it was decided that they wouldn't say anything about its environmental implications. At the same time, with the current administration, when you look at what's happening in Yucatan with the Mayan train, and when you come to terms with the administration's just complete disregard for the environment in Mexico, I think its response to the border wall is completely in line with that, right? But at the end of the day, I think that the reason why the film was translated to Spanish, the reason why we have Mexican environmentalists in the piece, and the reason why we're all here together is because this needs to be a dialogue on both sides of the border, right? And I think that it's very, very important, as Jose Manuel pointed out, right? The border communities are just incredibly fluid, and that is certainly not reflected in the political rhetoric in the country, right? And so, to the extent that this can be a conversation between both sides, between both countries, between communities on both sides, I think it will only enrich the conversation, and together we can push for change on this, right? And Jose Manuel, I'll just add that when John approached you with the footage, you went up to the Mexican authorities to submit and file a complaint, right? And the response that you got was that the damage was only on the US side, right? And this is in the piece, that's why I'm mentioning it. And it's absolutely absurd, right? But that has been the response from the Mexican government, right? And so it's important to raise awareness around this, around the environmental devastation and the responsibility that should be assigned to the Mexican government too.
Emily, can I say something?
Yeah, I was just going to call on you.
I have personally witnessed, and I would like to apologize to Mexico and its citizens. It really affects me because the laws that were violated, and I knew nothing about this a couple of years ago, as people, because of Myles and Jose Manuel and Valer, Clark and Kate, the list goes on, but the violation of the International Boundary Water Commission treaties is so blatant. When I see these blasts going off, the boulders are not just falling into the US, they're falling into Mexico. This is a very severe violation. And I'm trying to tell the story more at this point from the Mexican side point of view, because they are affected just as much as the United States citizens are. And it's a very personal issue to me. I've traveled quite a bit, in Mexico with Jose Manuel and Valer and other people, and they are the citizens along the border they're devastated. You know, that I've had people in Spanish telling me, and I didn't know this till after, but they said the animals, they realize that animal migration has stopped. And it really, really angers me that that we did this to our southern neighbors. And I welcome anybody. I will travel anywhere in Mexico to speak with groups or travel with environmentalists or to present what I've seen, you know, on a daily basis, because I'm really passionate about that. I almost don't, you know, the Americans, you're either for it or you're against it. I'm not going to convince anybody on the American side whether it's good or bad, but I will be, you know, I can help Mexico possibly, you know, get some help.
And I just saw a question on the chat box about whether we would be screening the film in Mexican festivals, and that is certainly the intention and the hope, right? And if any of you have any suggestions about other spaces, other public spaces where we can screen it and have these kinds of conversations, whether that's schools, universities, whatever it is, feel free to approach us, and we'll participate and help out however way we can.
That's great. Well, John, you mentioned a major realization that this narrative around the damage is happening on the US side was just fundamentally untrue. And I think with all of the witnessing that you're doing, I feel like you're in this position to be able to bust myths about the border. And I'm sort of curious, what other widespread misconceptions or things that have been propagated in the media have you found are just fundamentally not substantiated at the border?
Well, the film ends with, you know, walls will never stop people or animals, or not never stop people or drugs, but it will, you know, or walls don't work. I've said it so many times, but I have personally seen breaches in the wall, and one of those was documented, but just these, literally you can go to Home Depot or Walmart, get a battery powered reciprocal saw, you cut right through the bollard and one tack weld, and the entire thing acts as a pendulum. I've seen people cutting through them. I've seen people climbing the wall. You know, you build a 60-foot wall, we can build a 61-foot ladder. It's absolutely ludicrous to think that the wall has prevented any type of you know, drug trafficking from coming over or people from coming over. And as Jose Manuel was saying, that we built an infrastructure that has facilitated people to come over. You know, they have you know, roads that they don't have to traverse through these mountains. They can just walk down a road. And you know, it's frustrating. I don't really care about the money because it seems like the American government will spend money on anything, but I care about the human rights violations that are happening. It's very, very upsetting. And you know, what the wall has done has created this need for migrants to go through very, very harsh environments. They don't have, nobody can seek asylum at a port of entry or in between a port of entry. So they're being forced to go through these very, very dangerous places like Cabeza Prieta, and, you know, all through these deserts, you know, all through Texas. And it's just not working, and it'll never work. We have to, as a country, realize that migration has been happening for thousands of years. This is not a phenomenon that started with George Bush 1. This has been going on, you know, for climate reasons for thousands and thousands of years. And what we're doing right now is not working. And yeah, and I don't have any answers, but I know that the wall is not working.
Well, I think for so many of us that are, you know, living and working in these borderland communities, we witness that, we share that, we understand that. And I'm so curious, Daniel, you know, when you've taken the film now to different places in the US, away from the borderlands, what sort of response are you getting? Are people shocked? Is this not jiving with what they've heard? Really love to learn more about that.
Yeah, the film is a gut punch, and that was always my intention as a filmmaker, especially in the short documentary format. You have to be so efficient with language and words and visuals and sound. And John and Myles, when they saw it for the first time, they called me and said, "Oh man, I loved it so much. I wish it was longer." And that's the kind of reaction you want to hear when you're making a short, which is that it kept you going and it has that momentum. And people leave the theater enraged, frustrated, shocked, surprised, just like I said at the top, just totally changing their perception of the border wall, seeing it in a different way. And a lot of that comes from John's work and the work that everyone's doing. And I think one thing I've heard a lot, and this is kind of a fun anecdote, I was talking to a family member who leans a bit conservative. And if he's on this call, I'm not going to mention his name, but John knows who he is. And he came out of the screening and said, I don't want to open borders, but let me admit, this is not the solution. This is not the solution to the problem. And as a filmmaker, that's all you can ask for. I'm not going to solve the immigration crisis. I'm not going to pass immigration reform tomorrow. But if this helps people see that this is an antiquated solution to a modern problem, like Myles says at the end, China and Mongolia, if anything, it's a more antiquated version of the Great Wall of China. That probably worked better. If anything, they actually followed the landscape, but in the US, we don't. So if you come out of the theater thinking this isn't a solution, which we've seen again and again and again, then the film succeeded.
Right. Well, we're going to switch gears into what are solutions in just a moment. But since you mentioned walls around the world, I just think it's really important to note that this isn't a North American problem today. This isn't unique, unfortunately, to the US and Mexico. There's a wall being built right now on the border between Poland and Belarus. And so, Myles, I'd love to toss this to you and just ask, what should be the North American lesson that we are telling people around the world? What should people not do? Can you summarize what are the mistakes that have been made that have led us to this point?
Well, I think that we've all said this, like walls don't work. That's a very generic sort of thing to say, but it's true. I started working on the Borderlands in '96. And when I first was there for almost the first 10 years, I would see people every couple of days migrating. And what are they seeking? They were seeking work. I don't think that we honor the fact that the huge economic boom of the late '90s and leading up to 2008 was really driven by, cheap labor and immigration and people who came here to get jobs. And this is happening all over the world right now. There's an estimated, 50 to 80 million refugees, migrants, displaced peoples that are fleeing their homelands because of conflict and also climate change. And we arguably play a large role in driving the systemic reasons why some of these things are happening. So, building these structures, these border walls, they're killing machines. They've forced 5,000 people out into the hot deserts in Arizona. They find people all the time who've perished out there. There was an article that came out in the Journal of American Medical Association just last week about all of the deaths and injuries that are occurring from people falling 30 foot off a border wall. And in San Diego, they're getting more injuries from border wall, serious injuries, than gunshot wounds. As not like that's a good thing, like we want more gunshot wounds, but it's just telling that the surgeons are starting to see this, and they're being overloaded in their trauma centers because of these injuries, and people are strangling themselves on the wall. And this is happening everywhere. The border wall between Poland and Belarus is being constructed through the Biodiversity Forest Reserve, and that's an UNESCO reserve. And so all around the world, we're not honoring our protected areas. And then what's happening is that we're driving the most desperate people, the hungriest, the most impoverished people who have done the unthinkable, uproot from your homeland with nothing but what you can carry on your back, even sending your children, with others. We're asking them to, go through treacherous areas and inflict more death and suffering upon them. And we declare states of emergency, like the President of Poland had done to ram these walls through. And it's happening everywhere. There's 65,000 kilometers of border wall estimated in the world now. You know, in American miles, that's about 40,000 miles. But it's really not the way we should be dealing with our upcoming crisis, our current crisis, which is going to be more exacerbated by climate change and conflict, as we're seeing in Europe now. So we, as civilized nation states of the 21st century, need to figure out how to deal with the problem of migration instead of just putting up walls and just saying, let's just shut them all out and hopefully they'll go somewhere else. And a lot of those places where they're going to go are far more deadly and dangerous than they should have to deal with.
Understood. Well, let's go towards the solutions. Let's go towards the light here and figure out what are things that can be done. I know the statistic you have, Stephania, in the article around Governor Abbott's new wall construction project, $160 million for 8 miles. So that's $20 million a mile. You know, where could this kind of money, the magnitude of money we're talking about, how could it be redirected along the border to maybe more serious policy solutions and healing our communities and our land? So on that theme, I want to pitch it first to you, Jose Manuel, as a land manager, so tied to the land. What are some of the actions that you feel are really vital to help begin to heal the damage that's been caused and to restore the ecology that's been lost because of wall construction?
Yeah, our big threat is really the erosion that in a big event of rain is going to be created by all the bare ground that is already there. So it's a big concern that all that erosion that is coming, in our case, to the Mexican side. And the lack of wildlife passes in gates for wildlife, all kinds, big mammals, small insects, pollinators, pollen that needs to be forward on both sides of the border. So we need to address that with different NGOs in both sides of the border, with the Mexican and the US government addressing the principles of that issue and trying to get all that opens for animals and insects that are coexisting with us.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And the remediation plan, we don't know what the final product is, at least in our area, but it certainly is an opportunity for Customs and Border Protection to start punching some of those holes in that are vital for these species. So we do hope that there will be a response to this really important ecological need. Myles, from your perspective, along the border as well, what are some of the key restoration priorities? And I should say, we're talking about this in sort of our wish list, right? Congress chose not to invest the $150 million that was going to go for border mitigation in the last budget. So there's no funding for this, but when we can create it, what are the priorities?
Well, we need to restore wildlife connectivity. And as Jose Manuel mentioned, it's not just the big ticket species like the jaguar, black bears, but it's the common everyday animals that we would all see. Mule deer, white-tailed deer, javelina, bobcats, mountain lions, roadrunners, it's all of these species that form the food chain. There's predator-prey relationships. And if we have these border barriers in place, we could see regional die-offs of animals, which could, have cascading effects through the food chain. And especially in these arid lands where rainfall events can be few and far between. It may rain one place and not rain somewhere else for 10 miles away. And so all of those water sources, the springs, the tanks, the seeps that wildlife have relied upon for generation upon generation, now they're being cut off from those. And so in this era of climate change that's being more exacerbated, more frequent drought, more hotter conditions, now we are providing animals with fewer options when they actually need more than they've ever needed. So we need to remove major portions of the border wall. And if people are interested in security, well, you know, we could convert these to vehicle barriers so that it would still allow wildlife to pass through, and but, you know, prevent, you know, vehicle traffic that could run over, you know, sensitive lands. That was a problem in the past. But we need to restore movement, because you can't stop energy. You know, migration has been happening since the first paramecium jumped off the first petri dish. It's why do we migrate somewhere? To find better conditions, because things have changed where you currently live. And people forget that in the 1930s, we had this happen in the US during the Dust Bowl. Nearly 3 million people migrated from the Great Plains to other places because of environmental conditions, because of drought, because of dust storms. So this is not the first rodeo we've all been in. And we need to really look at our history and say, let's facilitate peaceful movement, you know, constructive migration. And what we've done with this archaic medieval steel structure is the most base, brutal way you could go about doing this. So I would hope that we actually start managing by the data, managing by the numbers, and help move people and animals in a fair and humane fashion.
Well, I think with, as you've been describing, I mean, there are so many things that feel so obvious to us who are working in this space. These things should be done. And I'm seeing in the chat just still sort of people are incredulous around the fact that the Real ID Act is hampering our ability to have environmental law. Environmental law would require the type of mitigations that you're talking about, typically in federal construction projects. So, you know, not only do we have a situation where wall is still being built, but we have no funding for restoration, and there is a completely lawless environment where there are not environmental standards to uphold. So as a society, we have to begin to put the pieces back in place to be able to do this restoration work and have the funding then to carry it through, of course. Daniel, I'm curious for you with all of this, after people see the movie and they're charged up and they're upset, you know, what do you hope people here in the US and Mexico, around the world, are going to do after they see your film?
You know, I think in 2024, the next Republican candidate is inevitably going to talk about building the wall. The wall has a tremendous ability to mobilize people. Trump understood its storytelling abilities, and Myles speaks to this in the film. He says something like it was the most expensive re-election campaign prop in history. And I couldn't put that better. I mean, Trump literally stood in front of the wall like a prop on a TV show. And politicians are storytellers, and they understand the power of symbols. And whoever comes next, whether it's DeSantis or Trump Jr. or Tucker Carlson, is going to use the wall as a prop again. And I hope this film and Steph's reporting and all the other great work that everyone's doing here and in the media at large, you know, takes the wind out of that argument. Hopefully people realize next time around, not everyone, but hopefully enough people realize that it's fraudulent and that it's not a solution. So, you know, as a storyteller, that's all I can try to do, is to try to correct that broken narrative and help people see it in a very different way.
That's great. Yes, I hope so too.
And I'll just add, because I kept thinking about the concept of lawlessness, Emily, that you just mentioned, right? And this really reminded me of something that Myles also said when we were talking about the fact that the current administration hasn't rescinded the waivers that Trump put in place. And Myles said that, you know, to him, these waivers are Trojan horse for the erosion of democracy, right? Which I think is quite interesting. And at the end of the day, I think that fundamentally, this is also an issue of perception, right? How we perceive the other, how we perceive our southern neighbor, how we perceive Mexicans, brown people, you know, migrants, as Myles mentioned, right? And you had a question about what happens when people are dealing with eminent domain cases. And it's really not only about the government's confiscation of their land or the taking of the land, right? It's about living in a constant state of surveillance. I mean, Naira Alvarez, one of the landowners in the Rio Grande Valley that is quoted in the piece, talks about what it's like to live at home with military-grade surveillance cameras and balloons that were deployed in Iraq and Afghanistan and floating thousands of feet above her land. And as we were sitting there at some point, she said, they can probably read what you're writing, as I was taking notes, right? And so that level of surveillance, that level of lawlessness is something that only happens at the southern border in this country, right? I'm staying in this country, although I'm in Spain, but I'm referring to the US, obviously. And certainly, as when we present the film, we went to the Big Sky Festival in Montana, and it was interesting to kind of ask the question to some of our viewers: what would happen if a border wall were to be erected along the border with Canada, right? And suddenly it makes them think quite differently about this project and about what it means and what it could mean for them, certainly, right? Because I think that for so many people in the country, the border wall, the southern border, is kind of in their imaginary, right? And so what I think is so powerful about this film and about the work that you all have been documenting is that it visibilizes this, right? This issue and this abstraction that people who live hundreds or thousands of miles away from the wall don't get to see for themselves.
I think that's a great point, Stephania. If you flip it on its head, last year I was doing an interview at a station in Montana, and I said, did you know that if the Secretary of Homeland Security wanted to blow up the Waterton Glacier International Peace Park, that iconic glaciated peak at Glacier National Park, if they wanted to drain the Boundary Waters canoe area, if they wanted to blow up Niagara Falls, if they wanted to kill every last orca in the straits between Vancouver and Canada, they can do that. And people says, oh, come on, no, they left. I'm like, no, they really can. They've done it at the southern border, and it's just a matter of time before some interest comes in there and wants to do that there. So I think that there's a double standard with democratic values and basically the implementation of rules, regulations, and the Constitution at the southern border than there is at the northern border.
Okay. Well, we're coming towards the end of our time, and our interpreters have been working extremely hard to keep up with our dialogue. So a big appreciation for them. But I want to give each of you a final chance to share what gives you hope about the border, something that you've seen, something that gives you hope to keep doing this work. We're going to need a lot of it. So I hope you can share where you're finding inspiration to keep going with our audience. Can I start with you, Daniel?
Yeah, I'll just say the relentlessness of everyone on this call: Jose Manuel, Myles, John, you, Emily. I don't usually touch activist films, to be honest. I worry about having too hard-edged of a perspective in a film. But meeting all of you and seeing the work you're doing, it just totally changed the way I thought about the topic. And you all have that ability to do that with other people. So there's a huge amount of work to be done, and Trump built a lot of wall, way more than people realize, and caused a huge amount of damage, hence the title American Scar, permanently scarring the landscape. And those scars, cannot be remediated fully. But, just meeting all of you and seeing, John living out in the desert on his own, doing all he can to document this gives me a lot of hope.
Absolutely. And John, what about you? You're still doing this work. You're still out there. So what's giving you hope?
I am. Fortunately, people like Jose Manuel and Myles and you, Emily, and people that know a lot more than me. Valer Clark of Cuenca Los Ojos has been a huge inspiration to me and what she's done. And I've only been involved in this for a couple of years. People like, Myles and you have been around for a long time, but I do learn quite a bit from all of the people I interact with. And I think that all of our visions, I know every one of us on the panel is very disturbed at what America, the United States, has done to our southern neighbors and our indigenous tribes. Tohono O'odham, I've traveled with some elders down there, and it's upsetting. And I just hope that we can vote, and it can be changed. I don't think the wall is going to be ripped down, but we could possibly let it be allowed to fall like it will.
Yeah. Myles, how about you?
That's a hard question because it is really hard to be hopeful. Especially when all I got to do is watch the news, and every governor running for the election here in Arizona is beating the drum on the wall, literally down there, every single ad. So that's really disheartening. It's also very disheartening that the administration is sitting on the fence, and no pun intended, but that's they haven't taken a stand on that, and I really wish they would, because there is an objective, quantifiable effect that this border wall is having. And I like to remind people that when they talk about the wall, they say, oh, I don't want to get political. Well, yes, it was made to be a political issue, and you fell for it. And lots of people are falling for it, but it is not a political issue. There's a real thing that's happening here, and it's a lot of destruction that's happened, and a lot of death and suffering has been dished out. What is encouraging is that I've had people from all around the world reaching out to me fairly recently, over the last year, in the same situation. And there's a commonality of feeling, of sentiment, how people feel towards these things, and that we know that there has to be a better way. And although we haven't made that 100th monkey leap as a species yet, I can feel it brewing. And I just want to keep on working towards that, and make this as part of my life's work, because it's not really work. It's just what I've become and what I do now. And it's I can't really see any other way, like John. It's just, what do you do? Well, I have to just keep on doing this. So
we're all very grateful for your commitment. Jose Manuel, your hope.
Well, as the work, as John say, of our founder, Valer Clark, start healing the earth in this biodiversity part of Arizona in Sonora, Mexico, and how with his work and his effort was able to restore and make a dry river run again. That brings us hope that a work of one person trying to heal the earth is possible. And as we saw last summer on the monsoon season, they opened all the gates for the floods. I think in the same matter, those gates could be permanently open and check for the pass of animals through these creeks, and that's hope. We need to find out more opens and the way to take off the wall. But at this moment, I think that brings us hope that keep those doors open and allow the wildlife to cross between the two nations.
Could be a simple fix. Just keep those gates open. It would start healing things right away. Agreed. And Stephania.
Myles, I'm of a similar opinion. And, I think that at the end of the day, what happened during the Trump administration, what we're seeing happen now, denotes a lack of respect for border communities that we've seen throughout different administrations. A lawyer actually at some point lamented the fact that he wasn't really seeing a vision rooted in justice for the border, for the southern border, certainly not under Trump, but not under Biden either, right? And this goes way beyond what is happening with the border wall. It has to do with immigration policy, Title 42, Remain in Mexico, and all of those other policies, right? But at the end of the day, I think that these kinds of conversations do give me hope, because what we're doing is demystifying the border, its inhabitants, the issues that surround this particular area of the country, right? And certainly as a reporter, my hope and my intention is to kind of generate and these more truthful and hopefully humane conversations around the border too, right? And I think that what we can do as storytellers is amplify the voices of the people who live along the border and suffer and live through these issues day after day, right? And whether that's experts, activists, or even also some of the people who have worked on the construction. You know, one of the most interesting conversations that I had when I was doing reporting on this piece was with one of the contractors. This was a man of Mexican origin. He was born in Tamaulipas. He was hired to work on their Trump in the Rio Grande Valley on the construction. And then he was rehired by Abbott to work on his stretch of wall. And, you know, we had a very candid conversation about the fact that to him, you know, it was kind of an opportunity to make history. He was making much more money than he was when he was working in drilling or at McDonald's or in any other kind of job. Contractors were paying him $20 when he used to make $7. And then suddenly he could go back to his family every night and not be up in Corpus Christi working on drilling, right? But at the same time, it got to a point where he was quite honest, and he told me, you know, being from Mexico, being from Tamaulipas, which of course is right across the border from the Brownsville area, he could see the town where he was born, and he still had family there. And at some point he said, you know, I often think to myself, look what you're doing to your own people, right? And so again, I think that many of the issues that we've been talking about are much more complex and nuanced than our politicians pretend them to be. And the way we can, I think, enact change and push it forward is by having these conversations and kind of again just making our understanding of the border much more nuanced than it is.
Thank you. Okay, one short final word from John.
Just one quick thing, as Stephania prompted this. I would like to see racism pulled away from this, because this wall was directly marketed and funded because of racism, and that's a big thing. That you know, we were sold this bill of goods that helped fund this this nightmare.
Well, so many different themes coming together about blatant issues in our society really have come to a head, including racism and lawlessness and all of these things at the border. I think what all of us share here today on this panel and probably in the Zoom room is just an interest to learn more about this and to raise our voices. And as Louise said in the beginning, give a voice to those that don't have a voice to tell their story. So thank you all for joining us tonight. We do hope that you will spread the word about these issues, share American Scar and the article with your networks, and help hold all of us accountable to not look away from these issues. We've got a lot of work to do, and it's going to take all of us. Thank you all for joining us tonight, and thank you panelists and interpreters.
Thank you, Emily.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Have a good evening.